now Deb Nicholson is a free software policy expert. And in the past, she's worked on issues like government transparency. After years of organizing on free speech, marriage equality, government transparency, and access to the political process, Deb joined the free software movement in 2006. And she was recently served as general manager of the Open Source Initiative, which stewards the open source definitions and works to raise awareness and adoption of open source software. And she's won the O'Reilly Open Source Award and the award for the advancement of free software for her efforts to broaden the free software movement. She is also founding organizer of the Seattle GNU Linux Conference, an annual event dedicated to surfacing new voices and welcoming new people to the free software community. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Deb to talk. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. Let's see if I can get slides to happen. That'll be interesting. Okay. Do you all see the slides or no? In the place that they should be? Yes? Okay, great. All right, cool. And now I can see everything. So that's nice. Fantastic. So, well, let's leave that how it is. Let me know if, I guess I'm not sure how you'll let me know because I think I'm on presenter mode, so no one can talk except for me. But I'm going to talk about open source and how to win friends and build software. This is my Twitter handle. I am between gigs. So if you have something exciting or lucrative, or let's be honest, I'm a perennial volunteer, completely unpaid, but still interesting, please get in touch. Today I want to talk about community in open source. We talk about it a lot. It almost feels like we literally never stop talking about community in open source. And it's a little funny because I think most kinds of work or endeavors involve like some amount of community. Like if you've even read one Harvard Business Review article about workplace culture, then you know like you can't have like zero community. Although if you do read Harvard Business Review, you know that like there are lots of ways for us to do it wrong, and there are plenty of articles on how we're all doing it wrong on Harvard Business Review. But it's okay. Like we're a little more intentional about community here than other places. Like a lot of workplaces only really invoke community when they want you to stay late or work on a Saturday. But the difference is that open source is made collaboratively. Like you can't build software collaboratively without collaborating. And that means on everything, like on adoption, documentation, testing, translating, marketing, and of course the code. So open source stakeholders just involve a lot of different people. Like you'll have people who are volunteers working with paid folks. You'll have employees working with employees who are at other companies. You'll have industry folks collaborating with nonprofits, academics, hobbyists, like literally all of it. So it kind of means your community game has to be really on point. So what exactly is a community? If you are already working in open source, you're probably already in one, or maybe two. Like a lot of projects are built on top of several different other projects. And so you may have thought you were just joining one community and find out a little bit later that you've joined 4 by accident somehow. And that's totally okay. At its best, community is a group of people working towards some shared goals. And at its worst, it's a group of people united in their misery. Maybe like, this is not that marching bands are miserable. Well, the outfits are miserable, but the music is nice. But sometimes community is just shared misery. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say we're not going for the world's most depressing resume support group, and that we're trying to build like a nice marching band, maybe with better outfits. So the first thing that you're going to want to do when you are building community is to find alignment. Are the slides still okay? I feel like they're a little, oh boy, okay, we can do that. And so alignment means getting everybody together, like on shared goals. And that means that you have to share your mission and your goals pretty often. It has to be on your website. It has to be when you're doing recruitment. It has to be when you are meeting new people, when we do booths again. If you're going to do a booth about your open source project, you're going to have to share what your mission is like pretty often. And that gets everybody on the same path. Having everybody on the same path is key because otherwise you have people doing all kinds of different things and not working towards the same goal. And you want to make sure that everybody knows why they're doing what they're doing. One of the things that can happen pretty easily is that a group of folks think that they're writing software and another group of folks thinks they're running an annual conference, and they might be doing both, but if they're not doing one in service of the other, they're going to start to kind of drift in focus. When you're all the way down in the weeds doing like the small things, you want to make sure that folks know how their small tasks kind of ruffle up to the larger, wider goal. And that helps you sort of loosen up the little fist of tight control and trust people to do their bit. And that, like, people can only do their small piece when they understand how it fits into the large piece. Otherwise, they're going to have to redo it. They won't have done it with the correct priorities. And shared goals, like, not only do they not just happen, sometimes it seems hard to get shared goals to happen. Like the history of religion is littered with schisms. Even the atheist community has had schisms, which I found really interesting. And a lot of longstanding academic communities have experienced schisms, which I'm sure a lot of you know. Like the linguistics field contains people who research animal communication, and then a whole other group of people who think it's really ridiculous to study animal communication. So, and when you look, at other kinds of things like nature, nurture, someone just asked me that in casual conversation, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm not going to pick a side on that. But even in our own communities with the one laptop per child project, like a large chunk of people thought that they were working on open source laptops for children. And another group of folks, and including the project lead, Nicholas Negroponte, said, no, the goal is cost-free laptops for children. And the project lost a lot of its community support by changing goals in midstream. Maybe the goal had always been one thing or the other, or it changed, or you had two groups of people working towards two different goals at the same time. But eventually they lost a ton of their community support and their funding, although funding at MIT is a little more complicated than that. But it's almost like we're just very good at not communicating and having, and disagreeing with each other. But when we do communicate, it's great. We get a lot done. So let's take a look at that. The first thing you want to do is when you find yourself in a community is find out why everyone's here. Open source has a lot of different stakeholders, and you might think they're all the same or they're all here for the same reason. But if you can figure out what folks came here for and what they want out of the situation, then you'll have less surprises further on down the road. Having a shared vision for growth is also really important. You can't just be recruiting new people with all kinds of skills if the project isn't really ready to onboard those people and bring them in and make use of their skills. If you're a small group that needs to bring in a person or two every time someone else leaves, that's one way of looking at your growth. You might need a large pool of casual participants to take surveys or try out your software or like kick the tires. Or you might be hoping to grow your project and see it adopted across several other institutions. The plan that you make with each of those kinds of growth will affect your documentation and your outreach. They just are not going to be the same. You can't just be like, we want everyone for everything. It has to be strategic. Otherwise, you have a group of folks that think they're looking at one thing, and then you end up with a big mess, which is something totally different. So without making a plan for each section, whether it's frosting or what have you, you won't end up with the result that you're shooting for. So So being very specific about the kind of growth your project needs is going to help you get to that place where what you picture in the future for your project and your community is going to be more likely to be what you'll get. I mean, the world is full of surprises, so it might not be exact, but you can get a lot closer if you're specific and strategic. Another thing that I think is a really good exercise is to find out how newcomers see your community. The way that communities look on the inside is often very different from the way that they look on the outside. And whether you do this by talking to your friends who don't work in tech and ask them to take a look at your website or see what they think about your project, or if they can understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish, that's a really great way. I've seen projects that have like a single self-referential sentence. They're like, XYZ software is building XYZ software tools. And it's like, oh, that's not very informative. You might also have like a situation where you're like, oh, newcomers are welcome. But then when you go to the page where it says that newcomers are welcome, like there's no link to a repository, or they ask you to email somewhere and no one wants to answer that email because it's like a 10-year-old account and it's full of spam. So stepping outside of your project to see how it looks to newcomers will help you craft a strategy for making your project appealing to the kinds of newcomers that you want. And you might find out that you need to compensate for like older versions of your project or like a general perception around the kind of project that you have. And that's not your fault, but it's definitely something that it's good to be aware of. So once you figure out like how it looks to newcomers and how you could make it better, asking your most recent newcomers to help you craft messaging to the next batch of newcomers is the best thing to do. It's very hard to look at a project that you've been involved with for 10 years with a fresh set of eyes, but a new person can give you a lot of insight on how your project looks to newcomers. So communities can be really hard. It is, being on the inside is very different than being on the outside. One of the communities that I was part of a long time ago was an arts organization in the early aughts. And our goal was to foster and encourage non-commercial art. And it was usually like pretty nerdy stuff that involved some research. We had an artist in residency who sold off like areas of his scalp as real estate. It was like a commentary on mindshare and capitalism. And we encouraged a group of artists to live on one of Boston's harbor islands and make art there. One board member actually referred to our mission as a smell. So we thought, oh yeah, this is like pretty casual. And so after a few years, when some of our founders had left or moved on, it was time to recruit some new board members. And most of us had art degrees and didn't know very much about nonprofit management, especially didn't know anything about board building. So the first time we brought in new board members, we did absolutely no onboarding, like literally none. We were just like, welcome to this meeting where we talk about what's going on. We're going to discuss fundraising for a couple of minutes and then share a bunch of gossip about local art events and things happening around town. And occasionally, with no warning, someone will propose a new project. These 3 new board members that we brought in our first time spent months and months trying to figure out what they were allowed to do or expected to do. It was very confusing. As longtime board members, we had this huge blind spot because we were used to people just knowing or just, smelling, I guess. And so like we had to, it was a big like, whoa, like, hey, we messed this up. And our new board members told us so. So so we did eventually figure it out. We were able to learn from the experience. So the next time we brought in new board members, we made a handbook and we leaned heavily on those 3 board members who were most able to see what the folks who had been around for a long time weren't able to see. So when you join a new open source project, or any project really, you may find them at any point along this journey to understanding what they want to tell new contributors and participants. And if you encounter a lack of answer to your questions, it may not be because there are no answers, but because no one has ever written them down, because they were at some point just understood by the core group. So what should you look for when you join a community, like an existing open source community? I would say the first thing you want to do is look for documentation. And they might not have it, but you want to look and see what there is there. You want to look for technical specs, of course, and figure out how decisions get made and what the community norms are. A lot of those will be like a contributor covenant or a code of conduct. Projects may have all of these or none of these. I would be miserly with the time that you spend on a project that has literally none of these, because you're going to have to do a lot of work. But some projects will have some of these, and just some of these will be a little incomplete. The other thing I highly encourage is to be really honest about what you are doing with the project that you join. So if you join a project and your goal is to, build an open core thing on top of it, you should tell people. Or if your goal is to localize this for like a whole other continent where the software isn't currently in use, you should tell people that too. Or if you just are like, oh, I wanted to see if we could make it work with this other database that it doesn't currently work with. All of those things are important because it helps ground your technical perspective. We like to think that our technical perspectives are separate and different from our real world concerns, but that doesn't usually make much sense or serve us very well. So sharing why you're there will help you to build trust. And, like I said, that will give people some grounding on where your technical perspectives are coming from. It will also help you find technical allies. Like if you're trying to, build French language support for a project, you might find that there are other folks that also want to do that. And you might even be able to inspire complementary work. Like if someone is looking to, it's possible that someone has been there for a long time hoping that this particular tool would work with the Mongo database. And they might be willing to do half of the work that you're interested in seeing done. So those are the things that you might be looking for, but what can you do for the project? So John F. Kennedy, if he had born later, should I try it with the Boston accent? Ask not only what open source communities can do for you, but also what you can do for them. That's not too bad. I live in Boston, but I was not born here. But it's a two-way street. So when you come to an open source community, you're not just looking, it's not the swag area of the conference floor. It's you're creating a relationship. You're creating maybe friendships and maybe long-lasting relationships. And so you have to also kind of think about what you're bringing to the table. The first thing that you can do when you're thinking about what else you can bring to the table is to look for what's missing. Sometimes that's space, less so in pandemic world, but a lot of times projects need a space to have an annual meeting or a space to have regular monthly meetups. And if you work somewhere that has space and you can offer that, awesome. Connections, it's possible that projects have been, looking for students, interns, people that want to test their software, people that want to help them with the user experience side of things. So you might have those connections. You might have people that are interested in working on bits of this code base that haven't yet been worked on. Money is a good one. Most projects are very excited to have money. And if you're in a position to donate money to an open source project, it means you're going to set yourself up for some pretty deep conversations about the roadmap with that project. Otherwise, you can give money without that, but I think it's probably more helpful to find out what the roadmap is. And then finally, perspective. Sometimes projects don't know that the tool they're developing in one area could be used in another area. And so if you're able to share that perspective, that can also be really, really helpful for the growth of a project. So I've been saying recently that open source is a relay race. Like we've now been doing open source for like 20, 30 years or something like that. And no one is going to take something from the beginning all the way to fruition. It's just like we're not immortal. So it's just not possible. Like the code bases that you work on will continue on whether you are working on them or not, a lot of times. And some of them will be here after we're all gone. But not everything is a relay race. So on my street this week, they are jackhammering every morning. Basically, like they are digging a hole every day and then covering it back up again. And they dig out the pipes and they work on them and then they cover them up again. And this probably makes sense because you don't want to leave gas pipes where people can mess with them. And so I understand why they're doing it for that, but it doesn't make any sense for software. Like, why do the same work over and over and over again? There's just no need to dig a hole and then cover it up and then dig it again. Why build 1,000 databases or calendar programs or CMSs or computational environments when we could all share? Like, so we could do the work and then just pass it on to the next person as opposed to like stuff it in a hole and then make the next person start over from scratch. So the sharing of code is kind of a big deal. I already talked a little bit about that. It saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of money. It saves a lot of effort. It helps you get a lot of eyes on your code. But I would say that more so even than sharing the code is sharing the idea of the practice of open source. And so this is like what I want you all to take into your day is sharing that practice. Like, so you learn how to do open source, you learn how to work with communities, you learn how to build software collaboratively, like across different stakeholders all over the world. And I want you to share it with the next folks. A bunch of years ago, I worked with a project, I was a founding member of OpenHatch, and we were really interested in trying to help people figure out how to make the best use of enthusiastic new contributors. And we found, we looked at all the projects that were saying we want more people and then trying to figure out like where they were falling down and not getting them. So we helped the Python meetups hold beginner workshops and host beginner tables at their hack nights. We encouraged projects to really look at their onboarding systems and make sure that they were starting at step one and not telling people like, jump in and then understand 300 lines of undocumented code. We wanted to make sure that newcomers had a path so that they didn't get lost before they got started. And that meant linking to like how to use repositories, explaining how version control works in a big project, and making sure that if the issue was like the specific programming language, that people had links to places where they could learn a little bit more about how to find the libraries they wanted, things like that. We ran a project called Open Source Come to Campus, and we visited dozens of schools, and we brought in bite-sized bugs for students to work on. And so like OpenHatch isn't around anymore, but we kind of expanded what was possible, what the conversation was. So there's like, now there's first timers only, which has also a lot of resources for people who are looking for a place to make their first patch, or people who are interested in looking for bite-sized bugs. And so even though we weren't there, it's, you know, I want us to all think about like how we can expand what's possible. Like we didn't necessarily like specifically pass the torch, but we pushed the conversation around open source contribution so that it seemed weird not to do more for newcomers. And so there's still more to do. Like, you know, I know that we're starting to see a lot more open source on campus, which is amazing. When we started OpenHatch, we were pretty optimistic about academic timelines and thought like, oh, in 2 or 3 years, like every college will have an open source program. That didn't turn out to be the case, but we're doing great. And I think I'd like to see the next few years show a lot more growth. So open source in higher education definitely continues to grow, and the folks here are a big part of that. And I think, as we think about like what we bring in the world, like sharing the code is great, but sharing the knowledge, the techniques, and how to navigate communities and the unwritten rules is even better. And if you can show the next person how to do that and how to like skip ahead and get started a little more quickly than you were, then I think that's an amazing contribution. So just make open source what you would like to see it be in the future. So I have picture credits, and I would be happy to take some questions from you all. Okay.
Great, thanks so much. I especially like I think you did nail that Boston accent. So I think.
Oh, good. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. If I haven't heard it for a while, it's very difficult.
I know Carlos and I have a couple questions, but I want to open it up first to the rest.
Yeah.
And I see definitely some of our fellows who have communities they have either started or getting started. So
yeah,
we need to ask questions about how to do that or how to maintain that.
Oh, so how to like maintain a community?
Yeah, I was gonna say, looking in the audience, I see a number of folks who are either working with or helping build up communities. So yeah, if you have any comments on that for individuals, especially for students, like most of them are either postdocs or PhD students who are themselves kind of building up their own communities.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's I think one of the things that you want to take a minute to do at the beginning is to state your goals. And so if your goal is to, build software that gets bought, like that's whatever, that's one thing. If your goal is to provide a specific tool for a specific group that is, reproducible or usable in whatever different settings you're interested in providing a tool for, being explicit about that goal and telling people, it can be really like, I feel like sometimes we fall into this trap of like getting stuck on the, the neat technical challenges. And then sometimes you end up attracting folks that want to help with the technical challenge, but don't really understand the project's goal. And that's, it'll just kind of come back a little bit later and you'll be like, wait, what? Oh, I thought everybody knew what we were trying to get done here. So yeah, take a minute and then like reiterate that. Like if you're like, oh, hey, let's, in 6 months, let's see how we are doing on our goal and what we need to do. Like, do we need to change course or double down or do more, do less, whatever. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe I can, I think my question really plays into that, right? Which is when we get Incubator Fellows, which was actually a big gamble when we founded Cross. We didn't even know that these people existed. We knew of one example, and it turned out there's actually quite a few people who feel very passionate about the technology that they have created as part of the PhD project. And they want to find a way to somehow keep doing it, keep being involved in that technology, really driving it and making it accessible to the world, right? And that there are obviously different paths. You can found a startup, but often they're not quite there yet. And so that's why we created this Incubator Fellowship. And it's this funny space where they're at. They are very familiar with the technology, have written a lot of code. It works. They publish papers about it. But now they have to create a community. And what they find is, okay, the original tagline that they had for the PhD thesis isn't really working. It's like, it's not really attracting people, right? So they're going through these different taglines. It's like what this project is for. And this is sort of playing into this, what you said, you need to find alignment in your project. And so I think that people are really, they just try to, if they would have just sit down and write their goals, it's like, how do I get to work on this in a sustainable way? not necessarily make
Yeah.
a ton of money with it, but it's, how can I just keep
Keep
doing it,
working
what I
on
love
it.
to do, right? And so,
Yeah.
so we kind of came up with some strategies, but I would really like to hear, whether you had some, thoughts about that, and how your strategies that would help them.
Yeah, so I think one of the other things that is really good, like as you're working on like finding your niche and your path, is to talk to some of the other projects that your project rests on top of, or like maybe you're reaching towards like one day we'll also be able to put this on WordPress or something. So talking to people about where those gaps are, you might find that there are some folks working on some complementary bits, or that it's a long time gap that everybody knows and there's a couple of people that are excited to help you fill that gap, or that the gap isn't quite like, maybe you think it's this, but it's actually over, just a little bit over. And so like talking to those related projects, like either ones that you're built on top of or ones that you're reaching towards and hoping to be integrated with, is really good. And then if you have like, maybe you have like you're building a Python version of something that a Perl version already exists of, it wouldn't be the worst thing to actually talk to the person who maintains the Perl version and find out what their path was. And just say like, hey, like I know that you built like a computational environment in Perl, and you had to like bring it from like, the user interface that like graduate students could use to this other place that, looked pretty or whatever it was, and like ask them about their path, and at least make new mistakes instead of like replicate mistakes that someone you could have like a 15-20 minute conversation with has already made. And so the more that you understand like where your niche is and what's around you and what other folks have done before you, the more prepared you're going to be to like move forward and not have quite as many missteps. I can't promise no missteps. That's just not possible.
Right.
But at least you can have new missteps, like I said.
I love this idea of like, we're helping you to make new mistakes.
Yeah. Let me see. Someone asked about making onboarding recursive. And I think that like one of the things that's really, like I said, it's very hard to like step back sometimes and remember where step one was. Like many years ago, when I started working at the FSF, we use Emacs for everything in the office, which probably surprises no one that was the case 15 years ago at the FSF. But I asked, I was like, where can I learn more about Emacs? And they gave me this book, and I was like, is this really volume 1? I thought there might be a whole other volume, because where it started was like so far out there. But it was a book created by folks who had been using Emacs for 20 years. So of course, like, there's stuff that they don't remember not knowing. And so the onboarding should always be auditable by your newest people coming in, because it helps you keep it like super up to the minute. Like sometimes you've changed something and you just were like, oh yeah, now we just do one extra step, whatever. And you didn't remember to go back out to the documentation and do it. But a new person who's trying to follow your documentation really closely will definitely notice. So if you can get new people to help you with the documentation, another way to make onboarding recursive is I've noticed that folks who've been working on a piece of software for like a decade or more don't really enjoy answering 101 questions. Like, I mean, they don't mind answering them every so often, but they might not want to answer them like all the time, like a half hour every day or what have you. But a brand new person who's been at your project for like 2 months could definitely tell someone who has just come into the chat or just approached the project for the very first time where the repo is. Like, and that's a great thing. I feel like teaching something really cements it in your mind. So like deputizing that super brand new to your like only slightly less new people is a really good way to help them cement their knowledge, but also like keep people who've been in the, who have been here for like a decade or more from having to always be like, here's the repo. Let me take a look.
There's actually a great question from Andrew as well.
Yeah. So what do you think are the most important things universities can do to encourage successful open source projects? Yeah, it's interesting. I think that one of the things that is really interesting that I've been seeing a lot more of recently is not only encouraging computer science students to become interested in open source. Projects need a lot of different things, and people use software in many, many different places. And so making your projects a little more open so that folks that want to help you with the website or the look or the logo or the translation or the user experience interface, all of those different things, so that you have like a fully rounded project as opposed to like a, you know, an undocumented mass of code, is the more bits and pieces that you can get in there, the more perspectives that you can have, I think the more sustainable the project is going to be. And it just makes it more, I think it makes it kind of more fun to like talk with different people about what you're trying to do and get more people involved. Like one of the things I think is really interesting, like I've done a lot of work with Python over the years, and Boston is a huge Python town because we have so many scientists and engineers and people doing, you know, just like a lot of data and data visualization. And Python has a lot of libraries for that. And that means that like when you go to a Python meetup, you could meet someone who's like, oh yeah, I have been reading all these letters from the 1800s, and I'm really interested in this one library that does a great job of sorting first source letters that don't have a real date on them. People used to just write letters and be like, started in July and then finish in October and then mail them, which databases, modern databases hate, by the way. You know, so like it just makes the community like really vibrant and interesting, full of a lot of different perspectives. And I think it's making sure that you're making the, you know, the mission or the, you know, undertaking of open source as widely available or as widely accessible as possible is going to be the best way to make it sustainable at your university.
Can I follow up real quick?
Yeah, totally.
So that's very helpful. So thank you for that response. Do you maybe like some more basic services? You know, like do you see groups needing more like, I don't know, licensing advice or governance advice or like some sort of like kind of infrastructure for an open source project? Is there anything that sticks out in your mind of sort of nuts and bolts that they might need?
Yeah, it's well, it depends on where you're at and what the open source program is like at your institution. For a couple of years, at least before the pandemic, I used to go over to MIT like twice a year and talk about licensing. And so having like an expert, and I'm not the only one, and I'm not even a lawyer, so like you could probably find someone more local. Doing that, I think the governance too, like I talked a lot about governance. I skipped over many of those topics, could be their own talks actually. Yeah, I think RIT does this periodically. I know Nitya's done it, like gone over there and given a talk about like, here's how we do governance, or here's how we do recruitment and retention or diversity or licensing. And so having experts in the field come in and talk, like people from the OSI or people in industry doing it, to sort of feel like, hey, here's what's possible and here's what a couple of different projects use when they're trying to decide on a license or when they're trying to decide on a governance model. It isn't well written down, like some of it. I mean, some of the licenses are well written down, but like figuring out how to apply them. And I think just having a person actually makes the most sense, because then you can have students ask questions and be like, oh, I'm writing this in Perl, like, should I be using the artistic license or not? Not like legal advice, but like, here's pros and cons and why people use the artistic license for Perl projects, etc. So hopefully that is helpful.
I think we have time for at least one more question, and I see Nithya's hand up.
I just wanted to say what a fantastic talk it was, Deb, and the fact that the practices, right, the cultural practices and norms of open source are often not shared widely or documented. And that's where the success is of, successful communities versus not. I also wanted to say +1 to knowledge on licenses that students and anyone working in open source needs to know. Very often, I think today, because open source is so well accepted, we take it for granted and we don't even, question what is the license, or don't make very intentional choices on what license should I use when I open source something. So I appreciate your double clicking on that.
Thank you, Nitya. And I would say also too, like, especially for the licensing, like, I mean, you can go out to Twitter or to Slashdot and get like any old person with a keyboard to give you an opinion on licensing, but not all those opinions are equal. So I would highly recommend, like, if you do get someone to come and talk to your students about open source licensing, that you get someone who is well known and respected and, is, not trying to, I don't know, fearmonger or just, get a lot of controversy started on Twitter. Those aren't going to be your best opinions on open source licensing.
We actually have a little bit, a few more minutes. Does anyone else have questions? I have one that I didn't want to take up time of others in the audience already. Any other questions? Oh, one thing I noticed in the talk too was you mentioned the relay race, which was great because it made me think back to some comments we had yesterday in our diversity and inclusion panel about the difference between ownership and stewardship. And so that's kind of a very similar theme. So I was wondering if you could just go on that, because I think that is something also for those who are managing communities to think about, is that continuation and continuity and how that also impacts your ability to be inclusive and diverse in your community.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people don't like to hear when they're building software is like, take a little extra time and build in redundancy. Like, people want to hear like, move fast, break things, which I think is famously Facebook's motto, right? And boy, they sure did. But it's, if you take a little time and build in a little redundancy, like have people like maybe shadow you on something that you're going to pass along to them, or that you might pass along to them, or that you might just want to go on vacation and not do for a couple weeks. Like, all of those reasons are great, and redundancy helps you, like you said, the diversity and health kind of topic, like giving people the space to be like, oh, my sister needs my help today, like, could someone else do this thing, as opposed to be like, wow, I wish I had spent the 5 hours to teach someone else to do this, because now I have to tell my sister I can't help her with something. And that's not taking care of each other. So building in redundancy, like documenting stuff as much as possible, like not being miserly with the access and control and the ownership over the different bits and pieces, like having at least 2 people who can do anything in the project. I think that allows you to do a better job of caring for yourself and building a sustainable project where people don't burn out and feel like they can take a breath and a break and then come back or pass it along. So that was a great question, Steph. Thanks.
I think it was also a great way to wrap up, to make sure everyone takes a break and takes a breath.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Go get water.
Go get water. All right. So thank you so much to Deb for a great talk. I really appreciated you joining us today. And it was a perfect way to start this morning. And we all have about 5 minutes to our next session. So without further ado, I will end this session. Great. And we'll see many of you in 5 minutes. Okay.
Thanks, Ebony.